Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Africa's retail industry is on the up, with international retail sectors successfully entering Africa's retail space. According to Chris Gilmore, a retail analyst at Absa Investments, retailers from the developed world have noted that Africa's 40% urbanization level already tops the Indian rate, which sits at 30%, and is not far behind China's 45%. Philani Nyalunga compiled us this report.
Africa's consumer spending is projected to reach $1.4 trillion in 2020, according to McKinsey Global Institute. These are enticing numbers for retailers looking to expand their businesses into the continent.
The population growth is very important, and second one is the middle class growth. Even the middle class growth has to be defined very well, and there are countries which are finding oil today, which is going to be another boom for the African continent today. And the aspiration is very important for the people. That is what is coming in. The urbanization is taking place there. Education levels are improving in this country here. There's a lot of interaction which is taking place between all the other nationalities who are coming and doing something in Africa today. And everybody is looking at Africa as an emerging market. And they are all coming and giving the hope to the people who are living in Africa.
But it's not all a bed of roses. Standard Bank estimates that Africa will need to invest at least $100 billion in the next decade towards its infrastructure development if it is to realize its economic growth potential.
Infrastructure, yes, it's a great challenge. We not just can't look at countries like Botswana, South Africa, and these nearby countries. If you go deeper into Africa, these are significant challenges. What you see going across, up north into the other African countries, yes.
Big giants like Walmart and Burberry have invested on the continent, but David Neal, CEO at Clicks Group, says this momentum might not be sustainable.
The US and Europe have their own problems to solve. So I think particularly if you look at retail, a number of American and European retailers now have to contend with austerity, and greater demand by European and American consumers for convenience. So some of the big hypermarkets that you see in Western Europe and the States are now kind of retail dinosaurs. So I think American and European retailers are going to have to sort of sort out their own problems before they can come here.
The sentiment is, though not universal, there is a fair amount of optimism.
No, I would not subscribe to the fact that that is a real statement. That's a statement of fact. I would not say. I think there is a lot of investment which is coming in here. Only from Europeans and Americans and those people, probably they would like to wait and watch and see that how the developments are taking place. But there is always British connection, so it is all happening.
Not only does Africa's growing consumer market and urbanization create an opportunity for big retail groups, it also creates an opportunity for the continent to be globally competitive. Philani Nyalunga, CNBC Africa, Johannesburg.
Joining me now in the studio to take a closer look at Africa's retail power is Chris Gilmore, retail analyst at Absa Asset Management Private Clients, and Humphrey Katungu, portfolio manager at Stanlib. And in our Lagos studios, we are joined by Sanaz Etibarian, the CEO at dealday.com. Thank you so much for making the time to join us on Invest Africa today. Perhaps, Chris, let's come to you. We've heard from the insert that a lot of the growth is pinned down on demographics and urbanization. Do you share those sentiments, and is there more to the eye than that story?
Well, Ziba, I think there's a lot more to it. Yes, it is urbanization, it is demographics, but at the same time, we've got to understand that a lot of this growth in consumer spending has been fueled in the past 10 years by the very profound increase in commodity prices and demand for commodities. Now, if that it has been slackening, and that has been built into the forecast that the IMF and the World Bank have been making recently. If that continues, it will, I think, undoubtedly lower the trajectories for African growth and in consumer spending. But having said that, currently we're looking at as if that's going to probably level out. And as a result, we're now looking at forecasts for about 5% this year for the whole of Africa and 6% for next year. The other thing we've got to bear in mind is that when we talk about Africa, we're talking about a huge continent. We're talking about the second biggest continent in the world after Asia. Now, nobody in their right mind would say, well, you know, Asia's a good place to go and invest, or say America's a good place. You've got to pick out specific countries because they all have their own idiosyncrasies, their own difficulties, their own challenges. So I think anyone thinking about coming into the African continent has to understand that it's difficult, it's big. I mean, if you look at Africa, it can absorb the whole of the US, China, India, and a whole bunch of other countries as well, just to try and dimension just how big the place is.
Of course, Humphrey, as Chris mentions, he says, let's remember that we're looking at 55 different states on a continent rather than just one holistic place. But let's maybe zoom into the hotspots on the continent. Which countries stand out for you as fastest growing in terms of their retail sector development?
Sure, certainly. I think when you look at it from that perspective, Nigeria, I think, stands out simply because from a population perspective, if you look at Lagos as a city, I mean, its estimates are that it holds anything between 10 to 15 million people, and much more than that, actually, if you expand the boundaries of a city. And that tells you that that there's a huge opportunity in terms of retail space. Much more so when you consider the fact that I think Lagos, last one we checked, has about 42,000 square meters of retail space. Now compare that with Johannesburg, which has about 4.2 million square meters of retail space. So that tells you that there's a huge opportunity in terms of retail expansion that is required in Lagos, and not from the point of view of just the main city, but also just make it more convenient for people to shop. So we're also looking at the nodes that feed into the city, you know, on the outskirts of the city, so that people are able to shop closer to where they live and work, rather than going into the city to actually do their shopping.
So now let me throw this question to you, given the fact that Humphrey has already put Nigeria on the desk in terms of our topic today. How do Nigeria's demographics and shifting demographics shape retail investment, particularly if you look at how retail investment has fared against other forms of investment in its attraction of foreign direct investment?
I would say that with a population of 200 million people, and the majority are a very young population who are connected now to the internet and to international markets and are internationally aware of what's available to them. And a lot of these young, well-educated population of Nigerians have the ability to access internet. So e-commerce is quite big now in Nigeria. They also have a big appetite for consumer goods. And what they want to know is they want to see the trends that's happening right now in Nigeria, and they get access to that through the internet. And these people, when I'm talking about the young population, it's a growing middle class that have a much larger purchasing power now than they used to about 10 years ago. So the opportunities are absolutely huge.
A big purchasing power, Chris, off the back of a very big or growing demographic. But where are the opportunities? Usually when you talk retail, we make that dichotomy between apparel and food. Are there more sectors that are giving really good returns to investors?
I think it's mainly apparel and food. I mean, if you look at apparel, for example, we were talking to Mr. Price Management a few months ago, and we asked them, and coming back to Sanaz's point, you know, what is the degree of recognition of some of these South African retail chains within places like Nigeria and Ghana? And they say it's huge. It's very, very big indeed. So you're up against competitors like Mango from Spain, for example, and yet the South African companies are in there with a high degree of recognition, mainly because they're able to be seen on things like internet TV, on satellite, whatever. We sometimes forget that South Africa is way behind many countries in the rest of Africa when it comes to internet.
Right.
We're about number 5 in terms of penetration, but when it comes to speed, we're number 25. We're 125 in the world. We're incredibly slow. Most African countries are way ahead of us. So I think that ability for particularly younger African consumers to kind of leapfrog conventional technologies and use the internet to gain recognition, experience, this type of thing, is something that we sometimes have a bit of difficulty in quite comprehending.
Chris, I think I agree with that. Certainly on the point that internet speeds are much slower. A lot of African countries are much ahead. I think where I would differ with you slightly is in point of view that, especially in Lagos, I see that the British brands have got a lot more recognition than the South African brands, because historically we've seen the UK having very, very strong ties, and obviously having being a former colony of of Britain, and a lot of Nigerians tend to travel a lot to the UK. So the Marks and Spencers and all those sort of brands, we see them getting a lot more traction than we see South African brands. But suddenly they're coming up quite strongly, I must say.
Sanaz, of course, a discussion here about British brands versus South African brands into Nigeria. From where you sit, are you finding that South African retailers have got a first mover advantage in terms of making inroads not only into Nigeria but the continent broadly?
Yes, absolutely. I think South Africa has already got a presence in Nigeria with retailers like ShopRite, Game, and Spars, Park and Shop. They are they're poised to open more stores across Nigeria. I think ShopRite's prediction is to open about 500 more stores across the country. Spars another 70 stores opening across the country within the next 10 years. But with I don't know about British retail, to be honest, but South Africa definitely has a very strong presence here.
Of course, Chris, when we were speaking earlier, you were saying that a lot of the foreign retailers, foreign meaning outside of the continent, are a bit reluctant to enter into Africa. Can you share a little bit about what's causing this hesitation on their part?
Okay. What David Neal from Plix was talking about in the insert earlier, I think what is happening is you've got this phenomenon in the wake of the global financial crisis. You've got a lot of companies like Tesco, for example, a classic example in the UK, where in their home market in Britain, they're finding they've probably got a bit too much retail space or a bit of the wrong type of retail space. They're having to downsize, they're having to tailor their operations to the existing capacity of Brits to actually spend. So I think that's going to occupy their minds for quite a few years. And Boris Planer from Planet Retail made exactly that point at the conference. He said, look, that's going to occupy their minds for the next 10 years. I wouldn't be quite as pessimistic as that from their perspective, but he did say it means that the playing field is probably going to be open because of that for South African retailers to fill that space and fill it very effectively.
But there's another model, and to bring you in here, Humphrey, I mean, if we look at the Walmart Massmart model, would going through a country like South Africa, which is relatively far more developed than the rest of Africa, be the most effective way of getting exposure to African markets?
I think one needs to go in directly rather than going through South Africa as a way. We see that linkages between South Africa and Africa are not quite what they would be, and you see also linkages within Africa are also not quite what they would be. Say, for instance, the east of Africa doesn't trade much with the west of Africa, for instance, right? Accessing, say, the central part of Africa from down here will be a lot more difficult. I think you need to have a more targeted regional strategy, maybe from the west approach it from Lagos and Accra, and from the east, obviously, Nairobi and Entebbe and Rwanda as well will serve as a springboard into DRC. So I think that would be a more favorable strategy than coming to South Africa and then using that as a springboard into Africa.
Before we go to the ad break, Sanaz, I'd like to bring you on this regional approach that Humphrey has indicated. Do you think that that's possibly more effective than going through a developed platform such as South Africa?
Well, I think, there is news that Walmart is going to be coming into Nigeria. Tesco's, Carrefour, all of these guys are actually coming in. But I think that's where we need to start. There's only 2 malls in Lagos, a city of 18 million people. So you can imagine the scope of, so it's just very spread out in terms of getting proper retail. We need proper infrastructure. The only way to do it is right now is to actually start with companies like Walmart and the bigger corporate companies like ShopRite and all of those people. Unless there's more development of malls, which I think should be happening soon within the next 10 years as well.
Of course, there are plans to see more malls going into Nigeria, but I've got a minute left, and I quickly want to throw a question at you, Chris, and that is, a lot of the conversation around retail opportunities in Africa is around formal shopping centers. Is this the only way of getting to this demographic boom on the continent?
Far from it. Even at the explosive rates at which most African countries are growing, they're not able to absorb the huge amount of labor that is there in Africa. And as a result, you've got this massive amount of informal retailing. If we take Nigeria, for example, and I'm sure Sanaz will be very familiar with what I'm about to say, there's a product there called the Gala sausage roll. It's been sold for the past 50 years, and it doesn't go through any single formal retail outlet. It's only sold on street corners. and it's made by UAC Foods, in which Tiger Brands has got a 49% holding, and it's phenomenally successful. So I think the FMCG retailers, the likes of Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Nestle, Mondelez, and all of these companies, will also do extremely well out of that informal sector, which is going to keep on growing, in my opinion.
Sounds like a lot of thinking out of the food box.
To interrupt.
Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think informal trading, informal retail is going to go hand in hand with organized retail. Absolutely, Chris. I think we're not going to see a diminishing traders and open markets. That's still going to continue because that's the blood life of Nigerian retail. So it will continue hand in hand with conventional retail.